Thank you very much. And somebody asked me who was the audience for this book, and I said everybody who enjoys eating out, which I hope includes all of you here. As Eleanor mentioned, I was a restaurateur, and I was a restaurateur at a time when few British people were going into the restaurant business. In fact, I think I was one of the first. And when I went into the restaurant business in 1981, every single menu in London, and in fact England, was written in either French or Italian. My chef and I, and the other people who were involved, decided that as we were all English, as our restaurant was in London, we would write our menu in English. And that was one of the first menus to be written in English. It was a challenge, and actually, because we were leading a revolution, we were completely unaware of the change that we were inflicting on everybody. But it was a very subtle and very important change. I've also become, over the years, involved in the Andre Seaman Awards, and that's a charity that is set up to judge the best food and drink books of the year. So this year we received Getting On for 200 food and drink books. 150, 160 of them were about food, of which about 130 were on barbecuing, grilling, baking, and dieting. Reading these covers and reading the books has made me realize that actually having a title that is different, and having a subtitle that is different, and having a cover that is different are incredibly important. And once I decided on the menu as the title, I decided that the book had to have this subtitle, which is called The World's Favorite Piece of Paper, which I believe the menu is, because it gives as much pleasure to people who are given the menu as to those who are giving the menu. And that is somebody wrote in the FT saying, I'd rather have a €500 note than a menu. But actually that makes somebody else €500 poorer. Whereas a menu is actually a really interesting transaction. And this was the cover that Unbound came up with. And it was the first cover they showed me. It was the only cover that they came up with. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. And it shows that publishers are to be trusted. I'd just like to say that also Unbound are a rather unusual form of publisher in that the book was crowdfunded. And just to give you an insight into that world, it's something I'd heartily recommend for anybody who's thinking of writing a book other than on wine writing, psychoanalysis, Thomas de Quincey, or on the menu, which is basically, it works as follows. You have an idea for a book, you approach Unbound, they say yes or no. If they say yes, they work out what it costs to have the book printed and delivered a certain quantity into their distributors in the UK. You work out the pledges, they give you 90 days, and that's how it works. And if you raise the money in the 90 days, which is the legal maximum, then the book goes ahead. So I raised the money, I started the work. The first chapter deals with a chapter that I'd actually written before the money was raised, which is called The Menu as the Least Expensive Form of Travel, which is that just looking and reading a menu and looking at them on walls and lavatory walls and any walls just takes you immediately to the place that it conveys. And then the second menu is from the 1960s and is l'escargot bienvenue, as it then was. I dropped the bienvenue part on my mother's advice, my late mother's advice, and much to the relief of all the receptionists who didn't have to answer such a mouthful. Anyway, this is from the 1960s, and it shows Georges Gaudin, who was the original founder of the restaurant. he sits there on top of a snail that has the logo Slow and Sure on it. It has all the address and so on, but it has the menu as well on the left-hand side, which was actually extraordinary. This was sometime in the 1960s for the pricing, because the cover charge was 6p, which was 2.5 pence. Most of the first courses were 25 to 50 new pence. The main courses were all under £1, and there was still enough left for coffee, which was 1 and 6, and cigars and cigarettes, which were then, before a smoking ban was introduced, a huge form of profit for restaurateurs. So this was sometime in the 60s, I'd say 64 or 65. But this was 160 years after menus were first printed. And this is one of the original menus from Paris, a restaurateur called La Veine. You can't actually read it, but it's something like 1805 or 1806, because there's Chateau Lafite 1802 in the bottom right-hand corner, and in those days wines were drunk very young. This and several other of the world's original menus are actually hanging in the Gavroche in Mayfair. And I interviewed Michel Roux, who's the chef proprietor there, about how a restaurant and a restaurateur could cope with such a large menu. And he was quite interesting. He said it was a bit like, I don't know how many of you remember Indian restaurants of 20, 25 years ago, where you could have any sauce with any protein. And this was originally how these restaurants were set up. There's a lot of the use of the word idem, which for those of you who remember your Latin, is the same. And there were a lot of cases of that. But he said it must have been an extraordinary, the people who worked in these restaurants must have been absolutely extraordinary, because the heat in them, the heat from the kitchens, where there was no air conditioning, and they were cooking on wood or coke, must have been absolutely extraordinary. And there would have been deliveries coming in all the time, and complete mayhem as far as ordering was concerned. It looks a bit like a page of a Lloyd's Register or shipping news, because in those days, printing technology that was all it was. But by 1900, it had changed and advanced. This was a menu from the 15th of October, given in Paris at the Restaurant Julien, given by Monsieur Auguste Germain for a Madame Louise Willy, who Wikipedia recalls as one of the first stars in pornographic movies, which started in Paris in the 1890s, as soon as the Lumiere brothers had invented the cinema. And this was an extraordinary meal. It started with soup, and then there was pheasant and a couple of fish dishes, and on the back, there are 6 inebriated men. I don't know whether they were the same as in the audience. I don't know whether the woman in the middle is Louise Willy or not, but it was the first encounter I've come across of product placement, because in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a G.H. Mumm bottle from 1900. So from there, we move on to the 1920s to 1950s in America, which was, as far as I'm concerned, the heyday of menu design. It was the heyday of menu design because cars were becoming increasingly common. People were driving out. Restaurateurs were realizing that the menu was the cheapest form of publicity. And it was the era of the great graphic designer. And these designers were so much more talented with their pen than our current lot are, because now everything is computer-driven and isn't quite as good as in those days. This is a menu from the New Yorker Hotel. It has a V for Victory and various slogans written on it, and it was a fantastic menu, almost as good as this one, which I was asked in a radio interview which was my favorite menu from the book, and I think it has to be this one. This was from a restaurant called the Oyster Loaf in San Francisco, and an oyster loaf was a piece of crusty, thick bread which was hollowed out and filled with fried and breaded oysters and sold very cheaply. And this was a graphic artist called Andrew Loomis, who was based in Chicago, and whose first book was calling Having Fun with a Pencil. And he certainly seems to have had fun with the mermaid and the lobster. I then talk about menu design with Mary Lewis of Lewis Moberly, who is a great graphic designer and who believes that design is life. She's responsible for the Moet bottle, the St. Pancras logo. And I showed her this menu from Harry's Bar in Mayfair, which was a private club, and it was significant because each of the categories is broken down, mostly in black ink, but each category has one menu descriptor in red ink. And this was designed by a graphic designer who's still alive called Willie Landers, and was owned by Mark Burley, a very fearsome chap, who I once asked, why is it that there is one category in red ink? And he said, and this you have to remember was in pre-computer days, it's because our eyes get tired and they need constant reviving. And this was a very prescient point, because he said, if you don't revive people's eyes, then they order the same as they had last time, or they order the same as their friends do. And he said, colour adds that vitality. Mary Lewis ends by saying that the menu has to be the invitation to the dance. And the question is, what's the dance? And I interviewed 12 top chefs from around the world, each of whom have produced fantastic menus. This is Massimo Bottura's menu, which is a fold-out 4-page menu from his restaurant in Modena in Italy. And it's a pizza. And a quote from Marcel Proust at the top. The other menu I have is from Heston Blumenthal's The Fat Duck, which is presented, folded up as you walk in, and is a complete day out at the seaside. And this is I think that's the final element of his day out, which he guides you through. So these are the 12 elements. These are the 12 chefs, 12 dances, and 12 examples of the world's favorite piece of paper.